Hello, I'm walking on the Esquimalt-Nanaimo Railway today. I'm just north of about mile 13 near Victoria. So I want to talk about the future of this beautiful, incredible corridor that stretches from Victoria, goes all the way through Nanaimo up to Courtenay. And as you can tell, it's quite overgrown, at least on this stretch. There hasn't been any train service since 2011. So that's 14 years of, that's a long time of holding on to this incredible stretch of natural beauty and deciding what to do with it. So I want to go over what I think are some options. I want to talk about the rail revival, converting the rails to trails, and then there's an option about rails with trails. And then finally, there's another option some people talk about, which is just redevelopment. And in the context of all of this, we'll go over some of the background, some of the history, and how it affects us to this day, and how it changes our path forward. Here's the railway looking north. This is along the Malahat. It was a very difficult section of construction back in the 1880s. Canada was a very young country. It had just formed. They had just completed the railway connecting the west and the east coast together. And Vancouver Island, being disconnected to the mainland, was left out a little bit. And so in 1883, the government gave a land grant to Vancouver Island, so about 3,000 square kilometers. They gave it to basically a private industrialist to build the railway. And back then, there was no consultation with First Nations, and there was no compensation. They did not cede the land to anybody, and so this still comes into play in terms of what to do in the future and how to correct some of that historical injustice. Let's take a look at the land grant in more detail. So I've superimposed the map on Google Earth, and let's zoom in. And you can see that the land grant is about 10% of all of Vancouver Island. That's a huge amount of land to give away. At the time, I guess the Canadian government perhaps was low on money, but it had a lot of land. So they decided to pay for this railway just by giving land away. And so this, in 1883, was given to Robert Dunsmuir, who the next year then formed the company called the Esquimalt-Nanaimo Railway Company. And the idea was that there was going to be a railway starting very close to Victoria in Esquimalt. It would go all the way up to Nanaimo over here. And it does seem a bit odd that there's like so much land was given, much more than just that section. So what this new E&N Railway company did, they immediately had rights to mining, they had rights to logging and private land. And they started making money basically subdividing the land, selling it off, and then also reaping the rewards of coal and timber. This to this day still affects this area because compared to other sections of Canada, there's still a very high proportion of private land ownership compared to public land. Here's a map showing all the old railways of Vancouver Island. There were two main railways. There was the E&N, which we're talking about, and then there was another one called the Canadian National Railways, the CNR. They came later in the 1920s. But the first one started construction in 1884, and they were working from the south going north, and another team was up in Nanaimo, and they were making their way south. It was much easier. This section was easier, so they made more progress. And in 1886, they met here in Lake Shawnigan, and that and completed the railway. Within 2 years, they extended it into Victoria, and they also added a section here to Wellington. So it was Victoria to Wellington, but the name E&N stuck from then on. By 1905, the E&N Railway Company decided to sell. I guess they had made a lot of money selling land and coal and timber, which was their main profit, and they sold it to the Canadian Pacific Railway, the CPR. So they operated the E&N Railway and expanded it quite a bit in the 1910s and 20s. They put in a line into Lake Cowichan over here. They also extended the northern route quite a bit, all the way up to Courtenay, all the way up here, and they also added a line into Port Alberni. And in the 1920s, they added a little section as well to the Great Central Lake over here. And during that time, the other railway company, which I mentioned, the Canadian National Railway, they created a line here in Victoria, and they came down here by Souk Lake, and then on the west side of Shawnigan Lake, and they created a separate connection to Lake Cowichan, which had a lot of timber business, and they even extended it here to some of these little operations going all the way out to Kissinger. So they had a line there, and they had quite a bit going up through Victoria and Sydney as well. So the 1920s and 30s was kind of the heyday of these two major railways. So where do we stand today with train service on Vancouver Island? There's just a little bit here around Nanaimo, some freight going on, and then there's a bit of train tourism here in Port Alberni. Otherwise, most of these tracks have been either abandoned or they lie dormant. In the 1950s, the E&N shrank. This section here was abandoned pretty much. We also have 1970s and 80s, the Lake Cowichan section was removed. And we also have the demise of the CNR route. So we have all of this section over here, these tracks over here, that passenger service stopped, and all of that as well. And most of those were turned to trails, the Lochside, the Galloping Goose, and then here we have the Cowichan Valley Trail. The rest is basically the corridor that is dormant. It's not abandoned. The remaining railways of the E&N are today owned by the Island Corridor Foundation. They're a nonprofit organization. And so they have many stakeholders at play. They have 5 regional districts, and they also have 14 First Nations. And together with the stakeholders, they are coming up with options for the future. I'm here by Shawnigan Lake, and here you can see, for example, the trail as it goes through some of the community. It's very hard to tell that it's still around. You have a bunch of homes that have built up around the railroad, and you have dock sides by the lake. You have children running up and down the trail that's next to the track. You have pets and wildlife running around. So when we talk about the future of the E&N Railway, we think about, okay, how would reviving the track work in an area like this? And it's not easy. Everybody loves trains. I do for sure. And so people ask, well, why can't we do it here in Vancouver Island, right? Why wouldn't the train work?
And to start, part of it is the history and the geography of Vancouver Island. I would say one big barrier is a railway puts up new barriers, right? Physical barriers. It's like a highway. It's like you can't have people walking near a highway. You wouldn't be able to have people walking near a railway track, especially a modern one where the speeds are higher than 100 years ago. Remember, these tracks were built for low speed freight. Back then, people could take all day to get to a destination. If you replace the tracks, which you'd have to because the ties are old, the rail bed is old, becomes more dangerous. And there'd be a lot of fences, there'd be a lot of barriers of no entry, no trespassing. And this gets to the kind of the bad history of how the land grant happened, right? Back then, the First Nations people suddenly were cut off from the areas they'd normally have for living, for hunting, for their livelihood. Fences went up, no trespassing, everything became private property, and they were cut off. And so if we bring back the rail today, it almost seems like we're doing the same thing again. We're putting up barriers, and I think that would be unfortunate. I mean, certainly you could work around communities. You could build tracks that go around certain towns, or maybe Shawnigan Lake, you'd have to build a brand new railway that doesn't go right through this beach community. But it's not as easy as a trail. Railways have to be very flat. They can't turn very quickly. It would be a huge expense on top of the expense of just replacing the whole track to a modern standard. So I think that's a big problem. The other issue I see is that there's something called a hypothesis bias. And it often happens for issues that have a good cause. So trains, they do have a good cause in the sense that they have economies of scale. You can transport very heavy objects with less energy, and that's a benefit. They also have a historical, romantic aspect to them. People love trains. So when you ask people if we should bring back the train, they would say yes. It's a hypothetical question. Of course we want the trains back, yes. What people do and what they say are different. It's like if you ask, would you pay 10% more for gasoline that is more eco-friendly? Most people would say yes. But then how many people would actually do it over time? They may do it initially, but then eventually they'll think, I'm in a pinch. I can't be buying this environmental gasoline. So even though I want it, I'm not going to pay for it. And so the risk is that we all say we want the train, but nobody is going to use it to the degree they say. Nobody's going to take the train once a month. The traffic just probably won't be there. Another thing to consider is the business case for bringing the rails back. Even the two main railroad companies here on Vancouver Island, they were already in decline as the highways came to being, as more trucks happened, logging started happening more with trucks, passenger service started to decline as people took their own cars or they took buses. And so the railway operators basically couldn't make any profit. And if that's the case, going back decades, right, it's hard to make the case today. And so why is Vancouver Island different to, let's say, a country like Germany, right? So Germany, remember, has twice the population of Canada, all squeezed in a place half the size of British Columbia, right? So there are a lot of big cities that are much closer together. There's going to be more traffic and freight and passengers, and so that's a place where it makes sense. Canada is very open. We have the big cities, Calgary and Vancouver, and okay, there's a business case there to connect them and have rail. But on Vancouver Island, you have Victoria and Nanaimo, you have some other smaller places. And with highways, the question is, can you make a profit? It's not just the economics of the locomotive and the cars that are actually good, but if you add the costs of the maintenance and the bridges and everything that goes with it, that total cost of operation can be higher than people think. If you compare a highway with like the E&N Railway from the early 2000s, right? Like the Malahat Highway has trucks and buses. You can count it per hour. It's quite high. So the utilization is quite good. If you look at the railway, there was one passenger service going from Victoria to Courtenay and back once a day. And I don't know how many people were on there, probably like 2 or 3 buses. So passenger-wise, it's very low utilization. And in terms of freight, I don't think it was very high either, right? So if you get your operating costs, spread it across very low traffic, right, then it just doesn't make sense anymore, right? You need to have continuous trains, like in Europe, where there's a train leaving the train station every few minutes. Here it was once a day, right? So what railway operator is going to volunteer to spend billions of dollars, probably will be billions if you add it all up together, and then find out, oh, well, there is no profit. And then we're back in square one again. Now we have to figure out what to do with the corridor. So when I say that I think the rail doesn't make sense for all of the island, I know I'm going to ruffle some feathers, but I want to say that I'm talking about the entire railway. Of course, there's some local decisions that can be made. For example, you have Victoria to Langford, or you have some local corridors, maybe in Nanaimo. Certainly, Port Alberni is a place where they're using a local section for some train tourism. That's fantastic. If there's a business case, I think we should definitely do that. But the discussion for this video is more focused on what do we do with the rest of the railway, with all the other connecting corridor that goes across the island. So if you look at polling data, in terms of what people would like from the E&N Railway, as we discussed, number one was the train. And the second choice was a conversion to trails. And I'm walking on one such example. This is the Cowichan Valley Trail. And you may ask, well, why do we need another trail, right? Like Vancouver Island has tons of trails. And there's a big difference between a trail that you would use for backpacking, a very rough trail that a more serious hiker would use, and a trail like this where you can commute on it, you can have a baby stroller, go on it, it's very flat. People who aren't very good with walking, they can come here. They can enjoy the incredible nature that's out here. And these trails aren't easy to come by. And so railways are a natural kind of flat area and long corridor to make these trails. A multi-use trail is a real benefit to the community. It raises the quality of life for everybody, and it's something that's it's an intangible benefit that's really very hard to measure. And as opposed to a rail, which you would take maybe once in a while and you would still appreciate nature, there is no comparison when you have nature right around the corner. Another thing with the multi-use trail is that it's a fraction of the cost of a railway. You don't have to worry about all the safety measures. You don't have to worry about the weight of a locomotive and having to reinforce heavy-duty bridges. You don't have to worry about fences, train stations, although we do want to keep some of them for museums and things like that. But a trail is easy to maintain. And if you need to reroute it, or if you need to shut it down for a while for maintenance, there's very little impact compared to a railway. Let's say we have a 50% chance that railway is coming back, but may take another few years, or it could take another 10 years. In that time, it's probably better just to convert it to a trail. And then you can always put the railway in. But in the interim time, at least you've provided a benefit to the community, and you've shown there's some value to the land rather than just having it sit there. And based on these chances, if the railway never comes, you don't have to do anything because the trail is already in place. And if you do want to put in rail, well, the job's a little easier because you've already removed the tracks and you've already exposed the right-of-way, and it's just a matter of doing the construction part. So another option that people talk about is rails with trails. So you have the railway in the background over here, and then you also have next to it, you have a trail. This takes advantage of the corridor sometimes being wide enough to accommodate both. The problem with this option is that you first have to get to the point where you want the rail. And then from there, if you want that, you have to then think about, well, how do we accommodate trails along the way? And the reality is that the trail would not be continuous because you can't put in a trail in a lot of sections. And certainly in bridges, certainly in parts of the cuts in the mountains or certain grades, there's just not enough space. And so what you end up getting is a bunch of trails that are discontinuous, that are perhaps used for local benefit, but it would not be a trail that would extend across the full E&N Railway. This is also the most expensive option because you have to pay for the railway upgrade, and then you have to pay for all the trails as well. So if you look at all possible options for the future, this is the highest. And if you don't agree on rails, then this option too can be dismissed pretty quickly. So the last option to discuss, probably the worst one by far, is just to redevelop the corridor. Basically break it up, sell it, and that is the end of the corridor. It's forgotten, and in decades from now, it will just be something in the history books. And so we think, well, that's probably an extreme case. That's never going to happen. We don't have to worry about it. But we have to stand guard, though. I mean, if you look at historically some of these trails, some of them were redeveloped, and that continuity was broken. Here's an example, right? I'm at the end of the Cowichan Valley Trail here. So I'm on the northern section, and the northern section was one of the old spurs of the E&N that went out to Lake Cowichan. And so I'm standing right now at this end right there, right? And the railway actually continued north. You can see how the street actually follows a direction. And it goes into this junction over here, right behind right here in Duncan. And then it matches up with the E&N and then it continues north, right? So right here, for example, you have neighborhoods. And on the property information, right, there's no corridor that's protected anymore. It's completely gone into homes, right? And so if a section is left long enough without use, speculators will come in and ask why the land isn't being used, and will make a case that it's better served as property, right? And so we have to be aware of that waiting sometimes can be risky. We don't want to end up in this situation where we have different sections and then we can't connect it anymore in one long corridor. So here we are at the Cowichan Station, 1885, 140 years. That's an incredible time gap. I wonder what people will say 140 years from now. Will they be happy to see some of this history preserved? Will they want this corridor still to be open, still to be a public good? I think for sure they would not want anything to go back to private property just because of the history of the land grant. This corridor is it's a national treasure and it should be preserved. And I think the best way to do it for the least cost and the highest benefit to everybody is to convert it into a trail. And we can keep the train history alive. We can keep this station as a monument. Thanks for listening. I have some links below that have web links to organizations that talk about preserving either the railway or converting it to a trail, different options, and a link to the ICF, which is the Island Corridor Foundation, who are the owners right now. Thanks. Have a good one.